do is talk first about mental health vulnerability pre and post COVID, because there were issues before COVID ever hit the map. And I see some people nodding as we say that, and we can talk a little bit about that. I want to talk a little bit about the role of schools in supporting mental health, and not just student mental health, but increasingly mental health in communities, because as you all know, the school is the aggregator in many of these communities for lots of people who are coming from all over, and it's a really important sort of place. It's a hub where lots of people congregate. And then I would like to help you think a little bit about systems issues, thinking about how do you employ resources in a smart, strategic, effective way, so that, even though all of us are overmatched in terms of the challenges that we're trying to cope with right now, we got to think in a smart and thoughtful way about what can we do. I mean, I think simply just sitting here and wringing our hands and saying, COVID is overwhelming, COVID is terrible, everybody's struggling, everybody knows that we're struggling, that's not going to get us very far. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to try to break that down a little bit and think a little bit more analytically about what's going on, what schools can do, and ways that you can think about being strategic. Let me start by saying maybe an audacious thing. I'm aware that I'm talking to an entire group of administrators who are managing all kinds of extraordinarily challenging situations right now. And I'm going to make the following claim. Maybe you'll give me a hard time for it, but I think that supporting mental health is likely the biggest challenge that you're going to face this year. It's going to be more intrusive, it's going to be more disruptive, and it's going to be more of an issue than I think probably any other factor that you're involved in managing in the course of the next 6 or 7 months. I think that if you look at the ways in which you have all been able to manage the logistics around remote school, hybrid school, in-person school, I've been astonished at how hard everybody's worked. And I mean, functionally what you all did was you came up with the ability to open 3 different schools, many of you, and you're amazing. I think what's really hard about this is that you're not easily equipped to support the mental health challenges that many of you are either encountering or going to challenge as you continue to work your way through this really difficult and complicated time. So let me talk just a little bit about what was true before we got to COVID, which seems like, I think that we've all lived through, the last 6 months feels like it's been 163 years. And it's just been this incredible, period of time that I was, March 11th, I landed, I was in Ethiopia, I came back, and it feels like it was 2 lifetimes ago. I've been here, I almost said stuck here in the United States since then. This is the longest period that I've gone without being out of the country, I think, in many years. I don't even know how many. So let me talk a little bit about a study that I co-authored with a couple of other people. It's now 7 or 8 years ago. I don't usually like to cite studies that are this old, but there's and I'm certainly not citing it because I wrote it. The reality is what we've done here is we wrote a study that for the first time evaluated the degree to which living as an international expatriate affected people's mental health risk. For many years before we wrote this paper, there was a lot of discussion in the clinical world, in the anecdotal sort of discussion about, hey, what is the effect of living internationally? And lots of people said, we know that it's a really difficult thing because you don't have the usual supports. You're dealing with all kinds of stressors that people don't have to cope with at home. There's lots of really great things too. So I don't mean to cast this just in a negative light, but when you think about the things that make people vulnerable to mental health challenges, there were a lot for people who lived internationally. And so what we did is, for the first time, we actually had a convenience sample where we were able to compare people who were living internationally with people who were domestic workers in the US. And we published this paper, and it was the first time that anybody had actually looked at this empirically in a really kind of methodical way. Candidly, it wasn't an amazingly tight study, but it was the best that anybody had ever been able to do in terms of looking at this and looking at good data. And so what we found is that people who were living internationally had increased rates for internalizing and externalizing problems. Those with internalizing problems are things like depression and mood problems. Externalizing problems are things like people who are acting out and disrupted in their life. There was more substance abuse in the expatriate population, which I'm sure comes as news to nobody. And interestingly, there was more problems in family adjustment as well. So just sort of in the most basic way, over the course of the last 8 or 9 years, we've known that there was vulnerability with regard to this. The question, though, was, what about kids? And it's a difficult thing. So, I've given a series of talks over the last number of years about talking about, hey, kids, what is going on with children in terms of mental health risk? And I saw, as I introduced some of this, I saw some people nodding when I said, look, there was vulnerability before we got to COVID, that a lot of schools were struggling to deal with a lot of mental health disruption in kids before this stuff ever hit. So if we go back, let me first apologize. We don't have good international data for these types of comparisons. And so these are US-centric data, which I definitely don't like, and we have to be very thoughtful about the fact that these do not necessarily represent everything in the world. However, it is the case that I think it gives us information about some of the challenges that kids are facing, particularly in international communities, in international school communities. So I think when you look at CDC data, CDC until very recently, for those of you who aren't really sort of hip to the United States sort of systems of medical aggregation, until recently, the CDC was a very apolitical organization that basically provided epidemiologic data to talk about all kinds of things with regard to disease in the US. And in the CDC released a paper in 2019, and they were looking at suicide rates that were in the 10 to 24-year-old range. And basically they saw an increase in that 10-year span of 56% increase in completed suicides. So we're not talking about suicidal ideation, and we're not talking about people who are just admitted to the hospital. We're talking about kids who actually die. It was worse, threefold increase, 300% increase in 10 to 14-year-olds. Those are data that you simply do not see in population-based statistics. You might see a 2 or 3% increase change one way or the other, and it'll have statistical significance. These are extraordinarily large findings. There is a Blue Cross white paper. Blue Cross, for those of you who don't know, is a big insurance company here in the US. So it has like a big, broad cross-sectional way of sort of looking at mental health trends and physical health trends. And when they looked at medical claims for care associated with mental health, there was a 63% increase between 2013 and 2016. And in pediatrics, when you look at hospitalizations for suicide attempt and ideation between 2008 and 2015, again, these findings are very, very consistent. The rates nearly doubled. The greatest increases were in 15 to 17-year-olds. So the reason I'm saying all this is because I think when we start to think about, hey, what's going on with kids, and every generation of adults says exactly the same thing. If you go back to the Greeks, they write about this as well. They say, look, kids, the kids today are not the ways that we were. When we were young and strong, we did our homework, we had good work ethics, we were respectful of our elders, we walked uphill to school both ways. It was one of these things where there's always this representation of the ways in which people think about their own history in ways that are very, very different from how people are experiencing kids. The point I'm trying to make here is this is different. Now you could say, all right, this is too clinical. Let's just kind of use more of a baseline like, hey, what about successful kids? Like, for example, the kinds of kids that you guys are going to be serving in many of your schools, kids who come from families with higher socioeconomic status, more education, more sort of access, and more sophistication, all of which historically have been preventative and protective of mental health problems. And so again, I'm using some United States data here because it was easier for us to get it. But if you look, so Penn is a large Ivy League institution here, and they've got 58 clinicians for 24,000 students. That's 58 mental health clinicians. There's a small liberal arts college called Swarthmore here. It's a highly selective, it's one of the sort of East Coast small liberal arts colleges. My son happened to go to this school. And I was just interested to ask him, hey, what's the situation there? He's graduated now a number of years ago. So currently they've got 17 clinicians for 1,600 students. That means that there's more than one mental health clinician for every 100 students. And if you think about a clinician having the capacity to put 15 to 20 people in a caseload, the point prevalence at that school is about 15 to 20% for people who are getting outpatient psychotherapy for mental health challenges. When my son was there, I said to him, hey, do me a favor, call and find out how long it takes to get in, because maybe they're not full. And he called me back and he said, yeah, it's 4 weeks before he could get an appointment. USC in the 2019-2020 school year increased its campus mental health by 50%. So the point I'm trying to make is that if we look at this in an aggregated way, it tells us something about what's going on with kids. So let me talk a little bit now. This was all pre-COVID. Let's talk now about post-COVID. So in June of 2020, once again, the CDC did a series of sort of carefully selected samples that were representative of the population here in the US. And they'd done the same thing 1 year earlier. And what's good about that is the difference between 2019 and 2020 is obviously COVID had happened. And so they used the same methodology and they used pretty much the same measures. And so there was a national sample, and this was occurring between June 24th and June 30th. And it was really having people ask or describe their self-report over the last 30 days. The participants in this were older. They're not kids or adults. They're 18 and older, 5,400 people. So we're talking about a big wampin slice of the US here. What was striking about this, omnibus findings, for those of you who don't speak statistics, it's the overall findings, the way that we think about this. 40% of the people reported significant adverse mental health conditions. Nearly a third with symptoms of significant anxiety and depression, over a quarter with trauma and stressor-related disorders that are in response to COVID. 13%, that's almost right around 1 in 8, described either starting or increasing the amount that they were using substances, and 10% of the people reported that they had considered suicide in the previous 30 days. This is a non-clinical sample. I'm pausing for effect here. That's not what we've ever seen before. So if you look back, to just try to, this is to break it down in terms of anxiety, depression, substances, and suicidal ideation. If you look at the anxiety, so, the people reporting significant and impairing anxiety, it's triple what they were experiencing the previous year. If you look at depression, it's about 4 times. Substances wasn't reported in 2019 that I'm aware, but again, very high. And then if you look at suicidal ideation, it's 2.5 times what was true just 1 year ago. So the point that I'm making here is it's not just that people are having a hard time, they're having a hard time in ways and at a level that are really impairing, which is why I made the really audacious statement about people struggling with mental health stuff in a way that I think is going to be primary in terms of the concerns that you've got as you try to manage yourselves going forward. If you think about the ways in which this affected different groups of people, they sliced it up in some interesting and important ways. One of the things that's really interesting is that the younger people in this sample were more affected by mental health problems than people who were older. So if you look down at the bottom of this slide, it's interesting because if you think about what we know about that, not just mental health risk, but physical health risk associated with COVID, what do we know? What's the single biggest risk factor for dying? It's age, right? Old people are at highest risk for dying or having very serious complications associated with COVID. But interestingly, younger people have more mental health impairment and older people do better. And the older you get, the better they do, which is a really interesting finding because again, it says something about the notion and the nature of vulnerability with these people. People with pre-existing mental health diagnoses are more affected. There's more anxiety, more depression, higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder. In the US, Black and Hispanic respondents were more affected. They're more affected in terms of the physical problems, but they're also more affected in terms of mental health challenges as well. So when you sort of try to zoom back, I'm going to try to I'm going to try to keep the doom and gloom portion of this, because as I'm talking, I'm looking at all of your faces, and I can see people's faces getting longer and longer. It's like, look, Sean, we already know that this is challenging. Look, throw us a rope. I mean, is there some good news that you're going to give to us? I think what I'm trying to do here in the first 25 minutes or so is trying to frame these issues in ways that allow us to be thoughtful and a little bit analytical about the challenges that we're coping with, so that we can think about what to do in smart and effective ways as we go forward. What we've seen primarily in the Truman Group practice over the course of the last 10 years is increases in anxiety, depression that we've really encountered. What's powerful about this is the traditional buffering factors, and this is now it's got implications for what we do. The traditional buffering factors that we could expect to help kids do better aren't buffering in the same way. A buffer in our world is where if you've got stress and you've got something in between that sort of captures some of the stress, ameliorates some of the stress so that you don't see the really bad outcomes. And traditionally, high achieving families who have high socioeconomic status, high intelligence, more worldly, better access to resources, historically, those people had all kinds of protection around mental health. And what's really weird and really interesting about what's going on now is that we're not seeing the same kinds of protective factors. And in some cases, it's actually increasing risk, in particular in the international school population. Let me just sort of shift gears slightly, because I know that, as we're talking about kids, that you're obviously all preoccupied with the well-being of the students in your school, but let's talk about you and your colleagues, okay? I mean, I think we got to think about the faculty and the administration's well-being as well in all this. And I think the first thing to recognize is that, the situation that we're in now for people who are doing remote work is this is not working from home. I remember early on people talking about this. Working from home in the traditional framework is about people choosing and opting to be at home so that they can be more convenient, so that they can have, a work-life balance in the ways they want. This is about people trying to get through a really difficult and challenging situation here. As I'm looking at faces, it looks like a number of you are in schools, and that is fantastic, because it means that you guys were able to kind of get back. And one of the reasons that that's so important is that social support is an incredibly important element in the ways in which everybody gets through this, including, and I would even argue, especially for teachers and administrators. One of the things that's been really hard about what we've all gone through is the degree to which people have experienced it in isolation. And even though there's been a lot of attempt, I think, to try to be linking, members of the community, it's been really, really hard. And I think one of the things that has been hardest, and I actually think that there is a special class of people, and it's the two parents who are teaching remotely who have children. I cannot identify a more challenging, more difficult group of people in terms of a group of people with more profound difficulty in coping with the things, because the teachers are trying to teach remotely. Their young children are trying to learn remotely. The parents are required in order to support the kids, but the teachers are supposed to be teaching in the classroom, and they've got no way to balance it out. What are they supposed to do? And I have had numbers of teachers just absolutely overwhelmed by the challenge of trying to make this combination work. It's extraordinary. I think one of the things that's really been powerful about this is sort of the challenge of work being everywhere for people. As I'm looking at you all, you look tired, and it's September. As I said, I grew up in a family where I was an international school teacher kid. And look, we all know the rhythms of that life, right? I mean, you come back in September and you are supposed to be perky. You are supposed to have a lot of go in you. And one of the really serious challenges is that people are exhausted because they've been incredibly disrupted in terms of the ways in which they've either not been able to get to their families and friends in places that are remote, or they've been able to go, but it's been so disjointed and so complicated in terms of managing that experience and many people had to work over the course of the summer while they were trying to figure out how to go back remotely, how to go back in a hybrid classroom, and how to go back in person, that it just took an incredible amount of resource to make this happen. The other thing, if you look at this last piece down here, is reintegration. One of the things that we're hearing a lot about are challenges of schools who are actually coming back together in brick and mortar schools, and that there are two groups. On the one hand, they're the group of people who remained at in the community over the course of the summer and sat it out. And then there are the people who went out, many of them home, wherever that was, and then they returned. And what's, for me, very unpredicted, but as robustly present in a bunch of schools, is that those two groups of people are not easily reintegrating together. And that there's conflict that's associated with that reintegration. And it's creating all kinds of difficulty and animosity among many of the groups of people who otherwise did really, did fine working together before all this happened. I think that we also want to say one last thing about this, which is, I know that many of you are under a lot of pressures around sort of making sure that kids are getting good educational experiences. I'll say this though, emotional disruption trumps intellectual engagement every time. If you've got a kid who's really emotionally disrupted as a function of what's going on right now, and you don't address that emotional difficulty in some way, the probability that that kid is going to be able to do well in a classroom and actually manage him or herself well is really, really low. I always use I think in these ways, I'm sort of a simple psychologist, and I used this example the other day. When I was a young man, my mother-in-law gave me a sweater for Christmas, and it was brand new. I'd stuck it on, and I was reaching over a pan on a stove to go grab a pot of water, and I caught on fire. So the question is, what are you supposed to do when you catch fire? Oh, come on, you guys got to know. So I see people's lips moving. Stop, drop, and roll, right? That's what you're supposed to do. You catch on fire, you stop, drop, and roll. And then what are you supposed to not do? Well, you're not supposed to run around. You're not supposed to wave your arms. You're not supposed to. Okay, so I caught on fire. It was like some sort of coating on the sweater. It like instantly there was flames that were like this high, and I couldn't pull my arm out because if I did that, it was gonna flop down onto my chest, and I knew my whole body would be on fire because it was just my arm. So I did that. The only thing that any sensible person would do is I was waving my arm around like this, and it lasted for about 2.5 seconds. It was like on and then off. And then once it stopped, I realized, it's really interesting. It never even occurred to me to stop, drop, and roll. It also never occurred to me to grab the full cold kettle of water, which was sitting on the stove, and pour it on my arm. And it also didn't occur to me to turn around where there was an entire sink full of soapy water, dirty dishes right there. I didn't do, all the dishes were not done. I have to cop to that. It never crossed my mind that I would put my arm my arm on fire into the water. The reason I'm saying that is because when you have acuity of emotional disruption, your ability to think in rational ways is actually interfered with at the most basic level. I won't go into the sort of the anatomy of it, but you literally shunt your thinking. The physiologic shifts that occur make it really difficult for people to learn effectively and well. So let me sort of talk about ways of starting to think about what we do here. The problem is there aren't enough counselors. And I said this to your counselors the other day when we had a meeting similar to this one, and I was talking to your school counselors, and I made some promises to them. I said, look, when your administrators come in, I'm going to say these things to them too, so that they understand some of the challenges that you're all coping with as you're trying to get through the day, because the big feelings experts, these kids are pouring into their offices. The challenges that their faculties are coming into their offices as well with disruption, and it's really, really hard because they're overloaded and overwhelmed by a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here because of the scope and the scale of the challenge. And so I think that there's some things to be thoughtful about. The first is there's more adversity than there are people who can manage it. We don't have enough school counselors to manage it. I mean, I just told you about some highly resourced universities and colleges where, there's no way that your schools are going to be able to match that level of resource for mental health stuff. There's just no way possible. It's not humanly possible to meet the demand that way. And so as a result, even though it's been a little dark, what I'm trying to say is the scope and the scale of this problem is really, really big. So we got to think a little bit about how can you strategically use resources, and how can you use your counselors, how can you use your faculty, and how can you use some of that stuff in a way that's going to make it more likely that you have better supports in place for kids and you're more responsive. The first thing I want to say is hope. You got to break out of this dark way of chronically describing how bad everything is, which might seem a little hypocritical given the first 32 minutes of this talk. I mean, what I'm saying is, hey, it's really, really bad. But let's be clear, it's not all bad. And the reality is that we are going to get through this adversity and we are going to find ways to teach kids to look after each other. And there is no group of people, in my mind, more able, better suited to deal with the kinds of adversity that we're talking about than international school teachers and administrators. Seriously. You people are amazing. You're the kinds of people who will decide that you're going to uproot your entire life. You get on an airplane, you show up in a country that you've never been in, you don't speak the language, you don't know anything about the culture, you may not know a single person in the school, and you're like, hey, I'm just going to be here for the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, and we're going to make it work. There are very few people on the planet who have the capacity to do that. It's an incredibly demanding challenge. It's an incredibly hard thing to do. And you people are surrounded by community that do that all the time. You know that when you go back, or if you're in your own community right now, but you're in an international school, it's not usual that the people are not usual. Would you agree with this? I mean, you can give me a nod or shake your head if you like, but I mean, this is not the usual way that most people function. And because you've got this extraordinary group of people, this extraordinary sort of conglomeration of experience and talent, there's nobody who's better suited to manage this experience than you guys are. As administrators, you guys could be like managing schools and, wherever, you're from, and it would be lower key and you'd be home and it would be comfortable. It would be so much more comfortable. You could go to your brother's house and you could barbecue in the backyard and, everything would be okay. And you've decided that you wanted to be in these communities, and it's an astonishing thing. One of the points that I want to make here as we think about hope is, what are the roles of schools and how do you think about the ways in which we can help leverage what you do and how you do it with regard to helping support kids emotionally and relationally? I think the first thing is just to think about the fact that school is a really, really important place where we teach kids about emotional regulation. What is emotional regulation? What do we mean by that? Somebody unmute themselves, I dare you, and tell me what emotional regulation is in a child. Everybody has gone from looking at the screen to now no longer making eye contact with Dr. Truman. I am watching you. I see you people looking away. Tell me.
So emotional regulation is the ability to be able to acknowledge and be aware of emotions and feelings that are arising for you, and being able to process them so that you're able to respond rather than react.
Yes, that's lovely. Thank you. Now, it's developmental, right? So you've just described being aware of and being able to describe. If you're just a little bitty kid, right, your capacity to regulate yourselves emotionally is really different from sort of as you go along the cascade developmentally. But as you get older, one of the core components to being able to manage yourself effectively in the emotional realm is being able to recognize what's going on, name it, and then try to manage it in some important way. The NBA finals are on right now, right? We see this all the time. If you see guys running up and down the court and they're fouled, right? What do? Has anybody here watched basketball? It's very US-centric. Actually, it's not entirely US-centric. There's a lot of people around the world who are watching basketball, right? What do? They go and they bounce the ball when they're doing a free throw. They blow out. They take breaths, bounce the ball, bounce the ball, bounce the ball in a ritualistic way, and then they do the free throw. Why do they do that? To calm themselves, to regulate their emotional state, because they've been running around banging against each other, running up and down the court. They're trying to bring themselves into sort of a more controlled physiologic and emotional state. Schools are incredibly important places for that. Who better than you to talk about what's going on with what a kid's experiencing? You can do that in the classroom. You can do that in the context of discussing history, talking about science. I mean, we've got a lot going on politically in the world right now. Who knew that science could be such an emotional driver, or political stuff could be such emotional drivers in the moment right now? And all of this is really important. When you think about distress tolerance is exactly as it sounds. It's your capacity to tolerate the experience of being distressed, where you don't feel that somehow something awful is going to happen. This is something that we've gotten really bad at. And it's one of the reasons, in my view, that kids are struggling as profoundly as they are. If you have the experience of chronically being distressed and you realize that you can manage it and you can get through it and get to the other side, it means that you don't experience your own emotional sort of shift in a way that's going to make you think that there's a catastrophe happening. Again, I think about this in physical ways. I started going to yoga about 1.5 years ago. First time I went to yoga, it was very hot. It was very humid. I was in a very contorted, I'm not a very bendy person. And I thought to myself, I'm going to pass out. I was hiding in the back because I was quite embarrassed. I was like the old guy, the old hairy guy in the back of the thing. There's all these alive 23-year-olds who can bend in all these different directions, and they never look like they're hot. They're just managing themselves really well. And as I went more and more, I became more and more tolerant of the experience of being in that very significant environmental sort of press. And as a year later, I remember going in one day and it wasn't that warm in the room. And I remember thinking, wow, it's not that hot in here. I really wish they'd warm it up. And I had this moment of like, wow, that's incredibly interesting that I've gone from, I think I'm going to pass out in this heat to, oh, this is something that I actually like and manage well. That's fundamentally just about adjusting to distress tolerance. Your ability to engage risk, which is of course connected to your capacity to manage yourself emotionally, these are the kinds of things that your kids should be able to develop in your schools. Failing, and then I would say the most important thing, recovering from failure is incredibly important. And you got to ask yourself as administrators and leaders of these communities, how are you modeling this for kids? How are you telling teachers that we want them to learn how to manage themselves when kids have a hard time, and that that's actually something they learn? It's a really important emotional component to development as we go through the course of our lives. Thinking about the ways in which other people experience themselves and need us, and that we can help them and reach out to them. Social sensitivity and reciprocity. These are all things that you guys can foster in your schools in intentional ways. Getting support, providing support to others, developing connections to other human beings. Those are all really, really intrinsic to making yourself manage well. So what I'm going to argue here is that you can do some of this stuff at different levels in your school. Now, none of this is going to be prescriptive. It's not my first rodeo. I've been to many schools, and I know that these are incredibly difficult things to change. I know that. And I know that you are dealing with difficult boards. I know that you're dealing with HVAC systems that aren't functioning properly. I know you're dealing with all kinds of adversity. But remember, when we talked about the challenges that you've got to deal with with regard to mental health stuff, it's going to help you to be thoughtful, at least in the most basic way, about different levels that you can perhaps intervene to try to support kids effectively. The first is just intervening on the individual level. Like, what do you do with a kid who's upset? You got this kid, what do you do? Then you can think at the level of, a larger group where, how do we think about, groups of children? How do we think about a grade level? How do we think about middle school? And then in the largest unit of analysis, thinking, okay, as a school as a whole, how do we think organizationally about fostering emotional strength and about responding adequately to difficulty? The first thing I would say is, hey, look, we're living through a really weird and really hard time right now. Everything is screwed up. But rather than dealing with that as though it's a catastrophe, we say, hey, it's normal. The ways that we're experiencing what's going on right now, it's because our emotional systems, they're working. It's hard right now. Everybody's feeling worn down. Everybody's feeling levels of distress that are outside of the ways that we usually do. And you want to be able to differentiate the difference between what hurts and what harms somebody. If somebody sticks a needle in you, it hurts, but it's not going to harm you. right? Feeling pain doesn't mean that you are injured. Feeling pain means that there's something that hurts. Harm is different. Harm means that there's something going on that's actually interfering with your capacity to manage functionally. If you slam your hand in a car door and you break the bones in your hand, you've harmed yourself, you've injured yourself. And if we think in the same ways with regard to the emotional world, you got to be thoughtful about kids being distressed and things that fundamentally are uncomfortable and painful and disruptive. We shouldn't represent those things as being harmful to them. Things hurting, it's normal. Humans have always hurt. Actually, we're incredibly well developed to manage all of those stresses. People frequently like to talk about trauma, and people like to talk about trauma as though it's this horrible thing that necessarily upends people's psychological function. Untrue. I worked with veterans who were on the PTSD wards in veterans hospitals here. I've worked with a lot of people who are sexual trauma survivors. I've worked with people who have experienced all kinds of things. There are experiences that absolutely do lead to all kinds of impairment, but it's also the case that people have the capacity to manage really significant disruptions and adversity and be okay. And I think one of the things that we've done in many of these communities with the intention of being responsive to each other is we've created context where we say if something really hard happens that it's traumatic and it's going to affect you in really negative ways. And the problem is if you tell people that, it's more likely to make it really disruptive for them. So I'm not saying that you should negate or that you should discard the idea that people who have been in really bad situations can be affected. I'm saying be aware of the ways in which you have expectations about how you think hard things are going to affect people in your community. We are resilient animals. We have managed always, and we will continue to manage. We're going to look in the rear view and we're going to get through this thing. One of the other things I think that you can do at the level of individual intervention is focus on concrete stuff. Here's one thing that you can do. I've been preaching this for 3 years now around the world as I go around. You guys have got to be aware of sleep with your kids in the school. We have the most sleep disrupted children that we have ever had in the history of the species. Why? This is why. There are very, very smart people who have developed technology that is designed to get kids to look at this device. I run a remote psychotherapy practice. I am not against technology. However, you've got kids who've got phones in their bedrooms, and especially given the fact that COVID has disrupted a lot of the normal cyclicity and regulation of how people kind of manage themselves in terms of structure, of schedule. It's totally whack for a lot of kids. You want to make, and this is true, by the way, for you too. I'm not going to look at any one of these cells too closely, but my question is, how many of you sleep with this thing by your bed? A number of people have just looked away from the camera. I see you looking away. And they say, well, it's my alarm clock, Sean, to which I'd say, yeah, there's a different technology we can use. It's called a clock. It way predated like this technology here. The reason I actually care about this is because people always say, oh yeah, I put it on do not disturb. The issue is when you turn it over to see what time it is, all of the notifications are on the face of the phone. And actually when you look behaviorally, it's astonishing how much, and you can't not read it. That's the other thing too. And you activate yourself. It's something to think about. Move and be outside. Anxiety loves sleeplessness. Depression loves sleeplessness. Depression loves people being locked in small spaces and being inside. It's what we do to our most disruptive people in society. We lock them in small spaces. It's called prison, right? So we want to do what we can to increase people's ability to move, to be outside, to sleep well, and to manage themselves. I'm not against the technology, and I'm not saying they shouldn't use it. It's ironic. I've gone around and I've had so many schools and so many teachers and so many parents say, Sean, would you tell me that this technology is so terrible? And I've said, well, actually the jury's out on that. It's complicated in the ways that people are socially connected, especially kids. Thank goodness we've had social media. Think about what the last 6 months would have been like for kids and adults too, if we had not had ways of reaching out to each other in this. Short-term goals, clear next steps, all good. Oh my goodness, talk faster, Sean. Group level interventions. Think about skills development, propagate big ideas. Like, for example, you could compete, like, hey, let's see, can the third graders sleep more than the fourth graders? Can the middle schoolers, like, get more exercise than, the seventh graders do better than the eighth graders? Like, do stuff to try to kind of enhance behavior that you think is going to help. One of the things that's really complicated right now is
I don't know. He just ran by and he's like, I know you're in a meeting.
You might want to just check to make sure you're muted.
No, it's fine. I'm just saying I can't cover you.
Maybe we can mute you all. I don't know if I can actually do it. You just check your mutes, make sure. Thank you. One of the things to be thinking about, and this is really difficult, is expectations around, like, how do you set the expectations for the school and how do you manage things effectively? One of the other ways of thinking about this, how do you get groups of kids together? Like, for example, thinking about stress management, peer support, just talking about stuff. There's lots of ways, and you don't need counselors to do this. Last, and I would say, think about systems-wide stuff, democratizing the responsibility for student support. Think about the idea that kids who are struggling should not reflexively be sent to the school counselor because there's not enough school counselors. I always pick on the imaginary physics teacher whom I call Bob. I say to Bob, hey, Bob, you got a kid crying in your classroom. You got to talk to the kid. And Bob's like, hey, Sean, listen, I'm a physics teacher. Okay. I don't do emotion. I want to be like, hey, Bob, buddy, you're a teacher. You signed up to teach kids. Okay. Like, they're people, you're an adult, you got to step up. So what do you got to do? Well, if you look down here, provide faculty permission to talk to kids about emotional stuff. Say, these are things that we need to be thoughtful about. Help them with language around this. Like, hey, how are you feeling? How are you doing? Are you doing okay? Are you sleeping okay? How's stuff at home? Like, you can talk to kids about this, and you don't have to have a master's degree or a doctoral degree in counseling. It's called being an adult and being a human being, where you're reaching out to kids. And as administrators, you can intentionally talk to your faculty about, we need as a group of people to be engaged with our kids in a more intentional and overt way. Give them practice. They're not going to be good at it at first, which is normal. And they're not, things are not the usual sort of ways that all of this has gone. Similarly, this is an issue that I have promised counselors I would raise, and I'm fulfilling that promise. The first is, when you think about how your school is responding to these challenges, and you're thinking at the highest levels administratively, is there a counselor sitting at the table with you? Or are you all, do you have the principal and the head of school and the director of development and the person who's the student service, or the dean of student stuff? Do you actually have a school counselor sitting at the table with you? There's a remarkable number of schools who are thinking about and sort of implementing policy around this stuff. And you've got nobody who's actually immediately trained or actually day-to-day working with kids in these ways, who is involved in the conversation. I'm not saying you give school counselors veto power over what you decide as heads of school. I'm saying it's kind of a good idea, though, to have somebody who does that work to at least be a participant in the conversation. Similarly, are you aware of what happens when things go sideways with kids who are having a hard time? School after school that I've been in, people say, well, we have a policy for that, John. I always say, okay, well, what's the policy? Well, the policy is, and then there's a procedure, and then they bring out the procedure manual, and they say, so there's a procedure manual. It's frequently laminated, which I like. Turn the page, and I say, okay, let's imagine it's Friday afternoon, because these things always happen Friday afternoon. You've got a suicidal 13-year-old girl in the middle school. Go. What do you do? And then there's always this pause. And they sort of shuffle over to the policy of the procedure manual and say, well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get our committee together. It's like, yeah, you're not going to get your committee. It's 3:15 Friday. Now everybody, so you got to be aware of what are the things that need to happen in your school in order to adequately support things when kids are experiencing high levels of disruption. Because right now, stuff's more disrupted. And what the point that I made early in this talk is, the level of disruption is high. It's not that I want you to be fearful about it. I just want you to be aware that what we're seeing right now is not like what I have seen in my career. Though I joked with Ed about, recently graduating from high school, it's actually been a while. I've been at this for 25 years, and I've not seen anything like the scope and scale of what we're dealing right now. Finally, I'd like to talk just very briefly about consultation. Ed asked me to talk about this. The Truman Group has been involved in supporting school counselors to try to give them a mechanism to be connected to colleagues and to do several things. One is when you consult in our world, it's a formal process where you regularly meet to talk about the work that you do, challenging cases that you're encountering, struggles that you're having in being effective. Because in your communities, so many of these school counselors are the only person in the community with really any significant mental health training, we've worked to try to upskill people in the communities. We started these programs in Africa. We're currently doing it around the world. The Office of Overseas Schools has been really active in supporting this. Ed has been really interested in having some of your communities consider some of this as well. We have a clinician from the Truman Group who runs the consultation, and then they get together every 2 weeks to talk about cases. It provides personal support and professional support, and really has been a really powerful way to help improve function and effectiveness and reduce burnout and sort of this helplessness. The other thing I would say is, to those of you who are not school counselors, and I recognize that's most of you, you have extraordinarily difficult jobs. You are being asked to manage in some of the most difficult and challenging circumstances, and these are some of the loneliest jobs in terms of responsibility. Being connected to your colleagues and doing that really effectively and well is a really powerful way to help support each other so that you don't get burned up in this process. Especially for heads of schools, because you're not able to really be completely open and reach out to your colleagues, because you're responsible for the school. You can't, these are people who all work for you. I would really urge you to be connected to other colleagues who are heading other schools, to form groups so that you can have a mechanism to help support each other and talk about what's going on. There's a lot of that happening informally. I would urge you to make it more formal so that you can rely on it in a more serious way. And then finally, if all of this is, you're going along and kids or staff are really struggling, the key here is to just be aware of functional impairment. If you've got people who are experiencing anxiety that is so profound that it interferes with their ability to do their work, or for a kid to go to school, if you've got somebody who's so depressed and so disrupted they're really not able to get themselves out of bed, or really not able to study, or really manage themselves, be aware of clinical resources. It goes without saying, the Truman Group, we've taken care of many, many people in a lot of the communities that you live in. You're always welcome to reach out to us. We've built this practice for you all. And if there's ways that we can be helpful and supportive for members of the community, we're really happy to. That said, this is not a big PR move. If there are people in your community that you can draw upon to help you with some of this challenge, identify those people early and think about ways that you can avail yourself of them. We left ourselves just a few minutes here. We can talk about, we can add, if you've got questions or if you've got comments, we've got a few minutes where we can talk some of that stuff over if you like. You can either unmute yourself, or you could just ask if you like, or you can do it on the chat. Have I completely demoralized all of you? And are you hopeless? You're going to go lie down under your desks now that we've sort of outlined sort of the scope and scale of some of this? I mean, I'm seeing a few people who are at least not completely dejected and demoralized. I think it's a really hard situation we're in. And the point that I'm trying to make here is there are things we can do, and there's ways for you to do it, and that you should have hope, and that it's going to be okay. We're going to find a way through it.
One question I had, and sorry, I also wanted to apologize. I'm a school counselor here, and as you can see, I was sorry for the disruption there. were getting pulled. So I'm back, and I apologize for not having my mic muted. But the question I have for the group is, you mentioned kind of one of the biggest things that we could do as a school community is support our community with sleep and technology. And I'm just curious to hear what other schools are doing, creative ways that they're doing to support families and students. And, you know, is that a technology pledge? Is that an educational week? So I'm curious to see what other schools are doing to support that.
That's a great question. Is anybody doing anything? Do you have any formal sort of structured way of thinking about it? Yeah, Amanda, I see you there raising a hand.
Yeah. So we have a standalone wellness program in middle school, grades 5 to 8, and they discuss sleep frequently, and we talk about it until we are blue in the face with parents. So we bring it up every time in every parent coffee. We will always mention the importance of sleep for wellness. It's just a constant that you cannot repeat enough times. We actually talk about you know, social media, getting phones and laptops out of bedrooms. We don't have a pledge or anything that students write. It's just conversational more than anything, but we don't recommend cell phones until high school. You know, they're optional, but they're not allowed in class. We don't want to see them. We have, you know, we're very, very, I think we're giving parents permission to parent well and get them out of bedrooms, and the importance of sleep. Yeah.
One of the great problems, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I work with Amanda, and we also have, we've done quite a lot of work over the years with our device-free policy, not only just mandating that we have the policy, but really trying to educate our students and our parents about why we have the policy. So we've got a middle school of about 700 students, and you know, it is very, very rare that we have a cell phone come to the office. It's like kids are very respectful of the rule. And I think the key is educating the kids about why you have the rules, not just the fact that you have a rule.
Yeah. There was a brilliant piece in the New York Times about 6 months ago about this, where they sort of asked people who were involved in technology about their own children, and they asked about when they were giving them access to technology, and they were far more conservative about giving kids access to technology. They're like, we know what we hire people who have PhDs in developmental psychology to try to make sure that kids spend time on the phones. I mean, it's about the money. I mean, make no mistake, it's about the money. They're designing these phones so that they'll be used and overused. And so I think one of the great challenges too is to be aware that not only of what's going on in the school, it's particularly what's going on at night. Do the kids put the stuff down at night? Because that's when they sleep, right? Of course you don't control it. And you got to tell parents that kids being upset that they don't have it in the night doesn't mean that they're being bad parents. I've had that question asked of me, actually, multiple times. Is it okay for us to say that they shouldn't have it in their bed with them?
Yeah. Sean, we have a question on the chat from Tom Fisher. How do we deal with staff mental health in countries where English is not the first language, especially in an international arena where teachers cannot go home and see family due to lack of time and quarantine and costs?
Yeah, so it's a little, I'm not exactly sure, given the way you phrase this, if the issue is you've got staff who are English speaking and for whom there are no resources locally because there's no English speaking, and or staff people who are not primarily English speaking. Well, basically the issue is if you don't speak whatever the language is where there are resources, what's the effect? I mean, the short answer is it's extraordinarily challenging. I mean, there's not only the issue around language, but there's also the issue around culture, which is a huge issue in terms of managing, you know, people's mental health, because there's very significant differences in terms of the expectations that people have about, you know, how things should go. The group that we started was to address this very challenge that you're describing, which is to say, okay, for people who are either primarily English speaking or very fluent in English, and you're in a place where there isn't English, or where culturally it's really dissimilar, how do we reach you and get access? We frequently are asked about trying to help find people. In some communities, there will be people indigenously who have some training, and it's very variable. I mean, in Swaziland, the last time I heard, there was one psychiatrist in the country. That was from a guy who's running a school in Swaziland that I spoke to this year. So, I mean, there are challenges that are just extraordinary in terms of absent resources. And it's honestly, it's why we do what we do. I wish I could tell you that there was a magic wand that we could somehow tell you that there was a right thing to do. There isn't. It really depends on where you are, what the troubles are, what the languages are, culturally what's happening. And it's a really difficult and thorny thing to try to manage.
And we have another question saying you talked about the need to increase counselors, or the fact that there aren't just enough counselors. Do you have an ideal number per student body ratio?
It's a really great question. You know, I don't have a number in my head. It's interesting, you know, the school communities vary quite a lot, and not all international school communities are equally affected by this shift that I described early on, where there's higher mental health risk. In some of the communities, there's some really dramatic changes, like in Bangkok, for example, or if you look in Beijing, or if you look in Delhi. I mean, those schools are disproportionately more like some of the Western European, North American data that I was talking about. I think it has to do with access and travel and just sort of the nature of how heterogeneous those communities are. There are schools, I'm thinking of schools that I've been involved in Central Asia, that are much, much more insular, where it's not as much of an issue, and kids are actually not as emotionally disrupted. It depends. I've been involved in conversations with heads of school when we think about, look, okay, we've got X number of FTEs. How do we think about deploying these guys in a way that's going to make it best and most responsive? And it really just depends on the idiosyncratic needs of your school. It's really, there's no single algorithm that I can really point you to. In general, I mean, I think if you've got one counselor for a school of 600 kids, I think we could say it's not likely to be enough. But that said, I mean, we're involved in supporting school counselors for whom it's the first year that the school's ever had a counselor, and a school of 400 students, and so one is better than none. Two in that context is probably better than one. That said, I mean, I think these challenges that we're describing are really, really significant. And I don't think that there's an easy way to staff this. There's not enough resources. You've got to teach. You've got to, you need PE teachers. You need to deal with all the other stuff that a school provides. And I get that you can't just be preoccupied with mental health and school counselors. I see somebody here saying 700 students in middle school and 4 dedicated middle school counselors. One thing I might also add just briefly, it's really interesting because we use the word counselor interchangeably with several different roles in schools. One of the roles is people who are social and emotional school counselors, people who are primarily preoccupied with mental health type stuff. We also have people who are college counselors, and we use, it's an accident of language that those two roles are I think intermixed, and historically it was always one person. I think increasingly we're seeing separation in those two roles, but lots of people have to do both of them, and frequently people are better at one of them than the other, and it's just, again, it's just one of the challenges of managing the resources as effectively as you can.
Are there other questions that you want to ask before we close? I do want to remind you that we have recorded this, and it should be available by Monday. Somebody with more technical expertise than yours truly, I'd probably say tomorrow, but give me till Monday to make sure I get it right. Other than that, I want to remind you that we will be back in touch regarding this project that Sean mentioned, which deals with establishing small cohorts of counselors to meet on a regular basis every 2 weeks together. It can be in their own school or with other schools. And those cohorts will have a clinical psychologist from the Truman Group working with them to help them sort through the many challenges and issues that they're facing right now. And we'll get in touch with you about how that's going to get set up. And we won't be able to offer enough of those support groups to everybody, but we'd like to be able to offer them for those who can help us make them go. It's great that so many of you were able to join us this evening. And Sean, thank you again for a wonderful presentation. It is a little dark and gloomy the first 25 minutes, you're right, but I have to jump on the bandwagon for hope. I think that one of the books that influenced me the most in my career was a book by a psychologist named Douglas Heath, who was at Haverford College. It was called Schools of Hope. And it has resonated with me for my entire career that international schools are places that know how to build hope. And we're at a place right now where that's important. And anything we can do from the EARCOS office to support what you're doing, you just need to let us know. We'll help you find resources or people to help you in your schools. But other than that, unless there are any other questions, everybody's free to take off and have a great Friday morning. Nothing? Okay, well,
thank you. I just want to say thank you. Wonderful.
Oh, thank you. It's good to see you all. We'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye. Sean, did you want to stay on for a minute?
Sure, we can hang on there for a minute, Ed.
Okay.
Sorry, I actually just thought of a question kind of while this was ending.
Yeah.
You had mentioned the difficulty of reintegration, and our school is still in a place where there is no reintegration yet. We're still separate, and that divide is very apparent. And so I was
wondering, where are you at what school?
We're in Myanmar, Irrawaddy International School.
Okay.
So yeah, our teachers haven't been allowed back into the country yet. Just wondering what recommendations you had for managing that currently with the teachers still being divided.
Yeah, was there a significant portion of your faculty that remained in Myanmar, or was there a big exodus when everything hit?
Big exodus, and we had a lot of teachers, just like 50% of our teachers just finishing their contracts and leaving the school to begin with. And then we only had 13 out of 65 teachers remain on campus.
Wow. I think the first thing I think is to recognize that it has been happening in a lot of schools, and that what's really interesting, Brock, is it's this race to the bottom for a lot of people, where each group thinks that the other group in some way had it better. Where this idea that, oh, you have no idea, we stayed and you have no clue about what the last 4 months have been like. And then the people who left were like, you don't understand. My mom has got has got 3 different risk factors. She was in the hospital. My dad is not well. And I was like driving back and forth, and we were, segregated and living in a complete isolation. And everybody's absolutely sort of sure that their version of the experience was the most difficult. It's a quality of what happens when people are experiencing high levels of stress that other people's experience frequently is not viewed in the same way. It's not just about this experience, it's writ large. And if you can say, look, we know that this happens, and that the goal here is that we've got to be intentional about trying to find a way to come together. And maybe one of the things you can do is get together and talk about, hey, how were you? How was it here? And then the people who were there can say, and then you say, how were you at home? What happened? And then they can say, you know what, we made reservations 9 times. We had to get a visa that was impossible to get. And then we needed a COVID test, which was actually not gettable, and it needed to be 72 hours or less. And then, and you know, it's this, you hear about these narratives where people were so stressed out and dealing with so much pressure because there was so much adversity and trying to manage the sort of logistics of dealing with all of this stuff. And that what you can do then is you can help people come together, where instead of it driving each other apart and competing for who had the worst life, it's like, no, we've all been through the ringer here. And we're all here to look after each other. And it's helpful if you've got somebody who's sort of got a high altitude version of, hey, we know that this can create division. And it doesn't have to. It's just that everybody's been suffering in different ways. And it's really been a really challenging thing for us all to go through. And that the version of what everybody went through is different, including people who've lost folks. I mean, we've had a lot of people who, and not just from COVID, by the way, we've had a number of people who've lost parents and they couldn't be with them when they died in hospital because they weren't able to be in hospitals when their parents, it was mostly parents that I've been connected to in this way. And it's been extraordinarily difficult on folks.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And I think we've done that to some degree, but not to the degree in which I think we could do it. And the other difficult thing is just connecting the teachers because they're 12 hours apart.
This is the other thing that's like, I mean, the logistics of this and the exhaustion where everybody's trying to manage in 2 time zones where you're splitting. I mean, you're nodding because I'm sure you guys are all dealing with this. I mean, it's just, it's brutal. If you're in North America and you're talking about, you know, a 10 or 11 hour, you know, difference, it's just incredibly tiring to, you know, to just do this day in and day out and try to balance it all.
Yeah.
And calling that out, I think, is useful. I mean, I know that it's not to whine. It's just simply to say, look, these are the kinds of things that create a lot of difficulty emotionally for people, and then increase the probability that we have problems as a group because people experience the adversity in these ways. And that you're aware of it and you're intentional about trying to balance it out. It's not magic, but it is helpful.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Thank you for the question. It's a great question.
All right.
I'm going to turn off the recording function now. Okay. So I think it's a good question and topic to end on. Brock, thank you for that question very much. And
yeah, happy Friday.
Happy Friday. Yeah.
We're not